The Process, a podcast about creativity and experimental music. In the world of experimental music, outcomes and accolades for creators can be uncertain and at times seem far and few between. Therefore, creators and practitioners of experimental music must embrace the one thing they will always have complete control over: the process. This podcast aims to understand this creative process by listening to new works and discussing them with their creators. Each episode focuses on one creator and their music. Understanding how and why they create can inform aspiring creatives and help audiences better understand and navigate experimental music. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and I'll be your host as we explore the world of experimental music, creativity, and the human need to find purpose in their world and lives. This is The Process. Welcome to The Process. I want to begin today's episode with a question that was brought up or expressed during my conversation with the wonderful composer, technologist, synthesist, Heather Stebbins. And the question was one that was posed to her as a student. And the question was, does the world really need another composer? So probably many of you creatives that are listening to the episode are probably like, ugh. You probably, like, your response is just like, ugh. So either you like hate that question or you can kind of feel the weight behind that question. And maybe you've never had anyone directly ask you that. Maybe you've never had somebody say, directly to you, does the world really need another you as a composer? Does the world really need another composer? But maybe you've heard it other ways, like, do you really need to write a piece with a C major chord in it? Or does the world really need another string quartet or another electronic piece of music? Or maybe it's even so microscopic that you're like, well, do I really need to write this next note? Does the world really need this next note? Either way, when the question was presented in today's episode, I immediately went to that kind of anxiety point in the creative process where you're like, is this any good? Do I even need to be saying this? And, I'd be interested what you all think as well about this, as far as, how crippling or how important or how you would choose to answer that. I think the question itself is kind of stupid. I think, yes, obviously the world needs another composer, and the world needs another art song, and the world needs another string quartet, and the world needs more art. So I think the answer is yes, the world does need another composer, and what you're doing is worthwhile. I may argue that maybe the world doesn't need another billionaire or another dictator or another war, or more homelessness, and racial injustice and inequality. But yeah, I think the world still needs like a composer, another composer, and someone who is dedicated into creating things. But I think we all get the weight of that question. And I think maybe if no one has ever asked us that, I think at least that for a lot of creatives, that is always part of our voice in the back of our head. So stay tuned for today's episode because I think Heather has some great ways of sort of tackling that voice, and she discusses how, she approaches that question. So let's take a moment to listen to an excerpt from the piece Ursa Major by Heather Stebbins and learn more about her and the work. Heather Stebbins is a composer, technologist, synthesist, and educator based in Washington, D.C., where she is a professor at George Washington University. She works with sounds created by instruments, objects, and electricity to generate new musical experiences. Her new album, Olney, is available on Bandcamp as well as at www.heatherstebbins.com. On today's episode, we listen to and discuss Ursa Major for saxophone, piano, percussion, and electronics. It was commissioned by the Vertex Sonora Ensemble, and today's episode is a live recording from the ensemble's premiere of the piece.
So for me, I mean, my creative process has changed pretty dramatically over the course of my, I guess, 15 years of compositional life at this point. But no matter what the process ends up looking like, it always starts with sound. So, I mean, whether that's a sound that I hear in nature or a sound that I create, or perhaps a particular sound I hear on an instrument, but oftentimes I need that. I mean, it's not tangible, but, you know, a sound that I know I'm going to be working with in order to jumpstart ideas. I've never been one to sort of have an idea pop in my head and, you know, pencil and paper notate it and be able to carry it through that way. I sort of need that sonic reality to work both with and against.
And where are you finding that? Is that on a sound walk? Is that from other music? Where are you getting that impetus or inspiration?
So both. I definitely borrow and steal a lot from music that I enjoy, whether consciously or not. I've definitely found that just, you know, my life as a consumer, a listener, influences my writing, as I think it does for everyone. But it could be, I mean, through a sound walk, like you say, usually not intentionally. I find like I'll hear something when I'm doing a menial task, like washing the dishes, and think, that reminds me of this, and that's interesting. Or it's generative. So I'm sure we'll talk about this, but in the last almost year, I've been exploring working with modular synthesis, and generating the sounds that I end up working with has been incredibly impactful for my process. Sometimes it's experimenting with instruments. So I'm a string player. I sometimes compose on my own instrument, but often just working with other performers. Not so much in the last 2 years, but that experience is incredibly inspiring for me as a creator.
So what kind of sounds are you drawn to on the modular synthesizers? Like, is it the correct way to use it, or is it the malfunctions? What interests you?
So, I mean, even though I enjoy synthesis, I'm using it more from like a sampling perspective. While I do, you know, traditional synthesis with some of the modules, I'm most drawn to working with samples and then, you know, wrangling them in some way, whether it's the correct way or the incorrect way. But I often start with a sample, whether it's something I've generated in the past or, you know, something that I get from a sample library. For me, that's been the most fruitful in that realm.
Yeah. You know, for me, I'll hear something. I'm kind of going back to this kind of crate digging era where it's like you hear something, you hear a break, or you hear something and you're like, oh, that would work really well, so I'm often inspired just by hearing, commercials, anything, just in the environment. I love that comment though too that you made about sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's subconscious. And I love this idea that, a lot of the minimalist composers talk about not denying the fact that they grew up eating hamburgers and hot dogs, you can't forget that. Do you find that sometimes that you're inspired by the way you were brought up? Is that kind of mixed into what you're doing?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I grew up playing, sort of traditional cello repertoire.
Sure.
But I don't think it's as much of that repertoire that's influencing my music. I was also playing percussion I was a snare drummer in the drum line in my high school, and I played guitar in a crappy basement punk rock band.
Yep.
And I didn't listen to classical music growing up. So, I mean, while I'm not writing music that emulates, say, indie rock, I do think my years spent, very steeped in that sound world influences how I deal with tension and release or energy flow. So maybe not from like a sonic level, actual pitches and frequencies, but more in, it sort of guides my musical intuition as to when structural things need to happen.
Yeah. And, I find I always have this kind of air of slacker culture. I think it's from like the grunge and like the 90s music that I grew up on, and just, that's always finding its way in when I'm making kind of decisions about, well, what's the meaning of this, or what direction does it need to go in? And it's usually like, whatever, man, whatever, like that always finds its way in. So it never gets too serious. Okay. So you have this creative idea, you have this inspiration, you hear a sound, you're messing around with the modular synthesis, you create a sound. When does that get on paper? Do we get notes on a page? Does that happen right away? Does it never happen?
It used to happen right away. I, in like graduate school and for a period after, I was very adamant that I would write things out by hand and then go to notation software at the last stage of the composition.
Yeah.
And that worked for me at the time because I had many, many hours to devote to composing.
Yeah.
And it was sort of this back and forth, working with sounds within a DAW and notating, both for acoustic and electroacoustic pieces. But then post-graduation and like life, a day job, children arrived and I only had so many hours in a day. And so the notation was the piece of it that I realized like, okay, I'm spending a lot of time on this. This is where I need to chip away, because I'd rather be focusing on the musical material, maybe not as much as how to communicate it. With my current sort of synth work, that is not getting notated. In the traditional sense, obviously, because it's for me for performance or recording. But
are you making notes though, or taking pictures of patches or setups that you have just so you can kind of recreate them?
I am for when I go to perform. So now that kind of live concerts are back, I have had a few gigs, both like at outdoor venues and indoor. I have one coming up that, fingers crossed, has not been canceled yet. Numbers are looking good in DC. But also for live streams and that sort of thing. And I will take pictures and like work with the patch in a way that allows me to recreate it. But I also just love the sense of improvisation that I get when I'm performing. So I don't want it to be too scripted. When I'm just generating material to see what I can make, I don't write it down because I think one of the beauties of working in this way is the impermanence. The fact that like, if I don't really engage with it in the moment, I'm going to rip out the cables and it won't be able to be generated again. And for me, that places like a sense of meaning and a sense of immediacy where it's like, okay, this is a moment that I have to fully experience because I'm not going to be able to again. And so I try really hard to engage with, if it is something worth engaging with, play with it in the moment.
Yeah. We talk often about being in the moment. And, I was talking to Robert Dick a few days ago about his improv. Mm-hmm. And, he talks about staying in the moment and being in the moment when he's improvising, because that's when he's just reacting. That's when he's just doing things. I have heard, though, some people like to, their sessions, especially a lot of like the mod heads, they really like to just like videotape their sessions, their practice sessions, just so that like if they really found that like Quinta Estina in the session, they can go back and be like, all right, what was the patch remotely like?
I'm not confident enough to watch myself. So I don't really consider myself a mod head, at least not yet.
It's inevitable, isn't it though? Like,
well, yes and no. I mean, I see the like, I'm at the edge of the cliff, right? Where it's like, I can look down there and I see the people that are like really knowledgeable about the gear and very obsessive about the gear. And I'm like, I could be that, but I don't want to, because I want to focus on the music, which is not music. Right. Yeah. And it's not one is good and one is bad. It's just, I know myself, and I know I would have a tendency to get wrapped up in gear in a way that would take away from the music I was generating. And so I purposefully don't let that happen.
I almost feel like scores are kind of a similar slope, that you can get 100%. Obsessed, like you were saying, like what do I have to take away from this process? Right. And those scores can become works of art in themselves.
Absolutely. And I definitely have seen scores like that and thought, shoot, I wish I could do that. My Illustrator skills are just not up to par.
I need to get the new version of Photoshop.
Yeah. But I mean, for me, I think I'm able to communicate to performers what I want, what I'm intending, more when I'm working with them directly rather than through a score. I tend to handwrite a lot of scores just so I don't have to deal with the Illustrator sort of conundrum, which in the in Ursa Majors we'll talk about, that is handwritten for a couple of reasons, which I'll get to. But also, I mean, my background is like, I was a performer well before I was a composer, and I loved improvisation. And I love when performers who take my score sort of semi-improvisatory, sort of react to the notation in a way where when one person plays it, it will be slightly different than another. And so I don't want to be so prescriptive in my notation. This is the premiere recording from the Vertexes Sonora Ensemble, who commissioned the piece. They're based out of Spain, and I sadly was not able to go to the premiere. So have only heard the piece in person in a recording studio. I will have a studio recording of it coming out soon. But the piece is scored for percussion, piano, several saxophones and electronics. Was written in 2017, and that was sort of a strange period, or not strange, but period of my life where I had a day job as a high school math teacher, also had a young son. And so composing was sort of this thing that I fit in when I felt like there was nothing else I could be doing at that moment. Like I had to be writing. And I mean, I got the commission and I wanted to do it, but the way that I was working was much different from, even 2 years earlier when I was in graduate school and had gobs of time to obsess over material.
Yeah. So it was really, truly like the last thing on the list that if there was time to get to it, you could get to it. Wherein often in grad school, it's like that is like composition is life. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I wrote the electronics first, and that took me some time, but truthfully, the acoustic material I wrote while I was on vacation on Cape Cod in like a week. So I don't know if I feel funny admitting that because it makes it feel like, oh, maybe it's not super meaningful. But yeah, I wrote it very, very quickly, which past Heather would have shunned.
Right. You have to just sit over this and just work and work and work at it. Yeah. And then there's an intuitive nature of it. And you feel like, well, I'm doing this intuitively. So it can't be, it can't be good. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the textures and timbres that you were working with in the electronic part / tape / fixed media part.
So it was a kind of odd assortment of samples that I was working with. Everything from, I had found this sample pack of recordings of electromagnetic fields of old pieces of hardware, and you get this very like digital sort of glitchy texture that when I first heard it, I was like, that is nothing like anything I would ever work with. But then I realized there were a lot of parallels to the natural sounds I had been drawn to. I mean, I've always been more drawn to texture than I am harmonic movement. And so like, I love working with samples of, stones in a metal bowl, for instance. So that was sort of related to these EMF recordings. Bees, there are bees.
I thought there were, but on a tape piece, I never try to be too definite because I'm like, it's probably just, something really abstract.
There were bees, not beads, but bees.
Yeah.
And
the buzzing bees. Yes. But at about 8 minutes, we hear what I'm calling a prepared piano.
The preparation around 8 minutes, I just took bobby pins that I have been using to pull my own hair back and put them on the strings, and it creates that sort of, I mean, you can kind of adjust which harmonic the pins themselves are, and you can get different amounts of dampening if you use, pins on all 3 strings or 2. So that's that sound world. I don't think I ever feel more honest than when I'm performing. And as a cellist, my skills were never good enough to perform in the way that I think I needed to. And now with these new techniques, I feel more like my musical self than I ever have.
Absolutely. And I think that's the pursuit, is to find the way that you can create and, the way that you can make music that is just, it feels intuitive. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, my very first composition teacher, always used to say, like, the world doesn't need another composer. Like, why do you need to do this? And, you know, that can be sort of taken as this, like, oh, shoot, I should stop.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure, I feel like. I feel like that's a lot of... I love it. I love the sentiment, but it feels like that could cripple me, like, real fast.
And it has. Like, I definitely have had periods where I have felt that way. But I mean, even in my periods of the most intense self-doubt, like, I've still had this... like innate desire to create and work with sound. So I mean, I do feel like I have to be doing this. Otherwise I'm like not going to be whole. And so like, while it can be crippling, like, I do think it's important to engage with that question, because otherwise, like, I'm not sure I could clearly articulate why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah, you know, that's a big pull. I really latched onto that statement because that's a big pull I often have, is that there's there's some responsibility in all of this, that, you know, there's many people that write many different types of music. So what am I doing? What's my thing? And what's its purpose, or what's its meaning? And I feel like that can be a driving force, but I feel like like on a note to note basis, I can like create a sound and be like, well, yeah, it's like piano in reverse. So like that's been going on for like ever. So like, why do I really need to be doing piano in reverse? Why am I doing this? Like, all right, I'm taking a break. Like, you know, like it can spiral like that.
Oh, for sure.
So I do like that. I do like that statement though. Like, like the world doesn't need another composer, but you need to be a composer. Maybe.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's truly, and I don't think I could articulate in words what I, or why I'm doing this and why I need to do it. But I feel it mostly when I'm performing. Something similar happens like when you're listening to your own music in a concert experience, but it's not quite the same as when you're, you know, both performing something and improvising something that you generated.
Yeah, and I love that moment when you find the idea. My two favorite moments are when you find that's like that thing and you're like, oh, this is going to work. This could be part of a piece. And then I love the moment now, more recently performing some of my works, I love the moment when it's like, oh, this actually works. Okay.
Yeah.
like, okay, this is working. Like, and you know, you're like seeing an audience response, or you're seeing some type of response, and you're
100%.
like, okay, it works. And then I'm like, all right, let's write the next thing. You know, you're just on to the...
Yeah, like you need those moments of success in order to keep going. And I have always felt, even when I first started composing, that I'm not totally in control, but rather I'm discovering the piece. And, you know, every time it happens, I'm like, oh, I just got really lucky. And now it's been, you know, like almost half of my life. And it's like, okay, there's gotta be more than luck going on here, but shoot, I hope I get lucky next time.
Absolutely. 100%. Well, this has been awesome. Before I let you go, where can we go to find out more about you and about your music?
Yeah, so I have a website, heatherstebbins.com, which is more of my sort of electroacoustic music. And then for my modular synth stuff, I have a synthtagram. I just coined that. Heather.Stebbins, and there's a link tree there where you can find some YouTube links for live performances. And then I had an album of synth works come out last December. You can find that on Bandcamp or all of these streaming services. So.
Great. And what's the name of that album?
The name of the album is Olney.
Great. Yeah. And they can find that all on Bandcamp or
streaming services. Yep.
Thanks to Heather for sharing her time and music with us. If you enjoyed this episode, check out other episodes in the series. And as always, like, subscribe, or leave a comment on your preferred podcasting app. I'm Dr. Doug Bielmeyer, and this has been The Process.